Am I on? Can you hear us?
Yes.
Awesome. G'day guys, my name's Farrell. I've come over here from Sydney, Australia as a part of an annual pilgrimage of Australians to Hacker Summer Camp. So thanks for having us. It's a good week up here. So first time presenting at any of the events, and I guess this presentation has kind of been an interesting piece for me for the last 18 months. And the whole fear and loathing piece that came off the back of this was from a presentation I was due to give in 2016 at an event in Perth. So what had taken place was I came across a building control system that shouldn't have been out on the internet whilst preparing for another client in late 2015. And then in whatever spare time I had, I decided to do a bit of research on it, off the back of which I found a whole suite of vulnerabilities that allow you to get access to these systems without any usernames or passwords or anything. But off the back of that, I then started researching, all right, where else do these building systems exist? I also managed to get permission to have a look at one of them in a little bit more detail, and off the back of that, discovered a very rudimentary XSS bug. But over early 2016, I spent my time going through and trying to do a bit of coordinated disclosure with CERT and a few other organisations in Australia, including the vendor who this was pretty much their first time ever dealing with anything in security. The vendor really didn't have a very positive reception to anything we found, and probably by about early February, they pretty much gave up on talking to us. So CERT, myself, and a couple of other organisations spent a lot of our time advising people and giving the heads up of this particular bug. Now, I was scheduled to present on the first weekend of May over in Perth. And in the lead up to that, we were actually trying to coordinate with a bunch of organisations to, hey, probably a good idea to take this offline. The vendor started to poke and prod with what we were doing. And off the back of this, I received a legal threat saying that everything I was doing was illegal, I was a criminal, and if you proceed, we will sue you. Now, the reality is, as far as I'm concerned, I don't really think we did anything too illegal. In one case, we actually had permission. But at the end of the day, I really couldn't go any further forward with this for the simple fact that I could not afford to stay in court for the next couple of years whilst this person carries on with this legal threat. So if there's anything we learned from Team America, letters aren't particularly effective when it comes to dealing with people. So as of May this year, we still identified that whilst the vendor had in fact released a patch and did it quite quietly, even though their whole disclosure policy on the patch included some text from the original release we gave them, at the end of the day, within Australia, there was still about 45% of these systems that were still out there, was still vulnerable because the vendor really didn't follow through and advise people. So this whole shifty and hidden method with which they approached security hadn't really helped at all. Now, there was also another 46% of facilities that CERT and I had been talking to who had in fact firewalled off these systems. Now, worldwide, I estimate there's another 500 of these, but I'm not really going to dive into those for the simple fact that, there could actually be further ramifications. So I guess my point with this whole piece is that, or with this initial engagement I had, was that the litigious approach that had taken place really didn't achieve a great deal. And when this was all taking place, I couldn't but help think of Dan Gear's quote from a few years ago that product liability such as this is really going to cause us more harm than good in the future. Now, look, that being said, I actually had a positive experience following my research on this BMS vendors system. So I was effectively going through the Australian public-facing internet, and I came across another series of building control systems that were managed by an Australian vendor. The product was from an Australian vendor. Now, the vendors asked that their name remain withheld, whilst they still go through a few other bits and pieces. But I had some initial observations and decided to dive a little bit further. And so since January of this year, I've been doing a bit of pro bono work for them. So I can, in fact, go through some of the facilities that we did identify, which included a Royal Australian Air Force base, as well as 52 Martin Place. So 52 Martin Place is where the New South Wales Premier and Cabinet sit. This is pretty much the executive branch for the state of New South Wales. It also was co-located with New South Wales Treasury as well. But the one building that really stood out was a facility called Ansto Building 80. This houses a 20 megawatt research reactor. It's the only nuclear facility in Australia. Now, my conversation with Ansto, they had stated that the system there was only responsible for working within the administrative facilities at Lucas Heights, and there was no impact on the actual reactor itself. So whilst that was the case, it was still enough for us to go, hey, look, we probably should be taking this thing offline, if not for any sort of second and third order effects an attack on that sort of system would result in, but just for the media value of providing assurance for a facility that just happens to be managing a nuclear reactor. So off the back of working with this vendor, we've identified several other high-risk facilities, and we've coordinated getting them offline, or at least putting them behind an open VPN. The application itself had heaps of cross-site scripting vulnerabilities, but the really significant one, and I haven't provided full details on the URL here, the more significant one was it was possible to effectively reset the administrator's password and get full control of the system. And then there were heaps of other low-risk issues. So all in all, we did this whole recon piece and identified 200 internet-facing facilities, most of which have been patched or are in the process of getting patched, just by taking a more collaborative approach with the vendor, with CERT and system owners. Now, the vendor is also looking at, in fact, I believe they've now implemented it properly, is having OpenVPN in front of a lot of these systems, just for some extra security. But they've now got a constant review and remediation program in place without any lawyers, without any overpriced consulting, or without any Gucci tech. So off the back of this was actually a really big win, just by taking a far more collaborative approach than the previous organisation. So that ends my my talk, as much as I can present in 10 minutes. Are there any questions?
So for those of us who aren't really familiar with building management systems, like what are the scary things that are controlled by a building management system that you could take over and do bad things with?
So, interesting question. Interestingly enough, I had a good chat with the first vendor, and off the back of that, we were able to extrapolate a few interesting attack scenarios. So, I mean, the more significant one that we picked up on was, well, if they're managing air conditioning systems that are responsible for keeping a data center cool, what happens if you turn off those air conditioners? But the more peculiar one that didn't really hit me was a lot of building systems are run by companies that lease out their buildings, and they usually run on pretty thin margins. So if all of a sudden you're able to mess with their electricity bill, and given the cost of electricity in Australia, that would be very easy. You could quite easily bankrupt someone just by increasing their power bill. But it would depend on a case-by-case basis of what's actually plugged in on the other side. But two simple examples there.
since we started a few minutes early with Ed's talk because we transitioned faster than I expected, if you have questions for Daniel too, he said he can also take some questions.
Presumably at this point you've contacted several vendors over the course of this. What percentage would you say react by getting on the problem versus the ones that react by threatening legal actions?
So the reality is I've only been working with 2 vendors, and both of them have had drastically different responses. One has put their head in the sand and then threatened legal action after that, whereas this other one really took a very open and honest approach. Now, I have started looking around a few other systems that are facing out to the internet, but I haven't really been approaching vendors just because of that really bad experience I had first up. I'm now kind of, and this is the other problem, is you then start getting reluctant to take that more open approach just because the rewards may not necessarily be there, but the risk is significant.
So what you described here with BMS, it rings very similar to what we see in SCADA and industrial control systems now. Mm-hmm. You mentioned establishing a security lifecycle program with them. So you brought them sort of from zero to having an awareness and actually building out a process.
Yep.
How did you take an organization that, by example here, didn't have a good skill set, a good fundamental understanding in the first place, and educate them to the need and then actually build that process with them?
No, interesting. So, look, I come from a pen testing background, and before that, network engineering. So, I tend to have that sort of very narrow focus, and taking that approach of, hey guys, look, here's something that's kind of interesting. You may want to be thinking about these controls in place, taking them through that sort of initial, let's actually start having a look at what's here and breaking it down. That was sort of my initial standpoint with approaching these guys. But off the back of that, I think it was also interesting where I was hearing on their side of, well, this is actually what our concerns are. So there's kind of a good sort of mix, engaging with that vendor of understanding what they're after and, bringing that little bit I know about what problems do exist out there.
We have time for one more question.
I was curious with the work you said you were doing pro bono.
Yep.
What was the decision to go pro bono versus setting up some contract or whatever?
I think it was twofold. One is, these guys already... The problem with building management systems in Australia and technology as a whole is if I was to do it as a consulting engagement, it would actually be expensive. I would also argue that it would be a bit of a conflict as well. Like I don't believe in ambulance chasing. So I think that was a big reason why I chose to go pro bono. It also meant that I can actually kind of be a little bit more open, a little bit more honest about it, and even come out and talk about these issues quite openly without disclosing too much, even still. So I think by taking a pro bono approach, it was going to be taken on. It meant I could actually give an honest opinion, but it also meant that I could actually, talk about this a little bit more. Whereas, say, if it was a paid customer, it would have taken longer to get things done. For me, I would have actually felt quite guilty about taking money off, finding these bugs in the first place without any solicitation. And thirdly, I would be compelled to actually not talk about it and turn this into a lesson, which is really where I wanted to take this research after the back of the legal threat.
Thank you very much. And again, if you would like to continue the conversation with these presenters, please follow them on Peerlist.
Thank you.